In the next two presentations, I want to discuss the factors that affect force production. There are a number of factors that can alter how much force a muscle can produce within a person or between people and so on. Muscle size, for instance, more muscle fibers equals more contractile proteins, which means a greater amount of force can be generated potentially. So there's lots of factors that can affect how strong a muscle can contract and the force it can produce. Some of these factors are set. We can't alter them. We can't change the fiber arrangement of the deltoid or the biceps. We can, however, alter some factors, such as hypertrophy of muscle through the training we provide, or improve the efficiency, the neuromuscular efficiency of a muscle with training. So in the next couple presentations, we're going to look at a number of these different factors, talk about which ones are modifiable, and then give examples of how they can be modified through the exercise we prescribe. So we're going to go over a couple different factors here. And while we're going through this, I want you to think about, kind of the mechanics of muscle tissue and how it works. But I also want you to think about the different factors that affect strength, but more importantly, the factors that we can modify or alter with our training, and then the ones that we can't. I'll talk a little bit about how we can alter some of these as we go through the presentation, but really this is something that we're going to discuss in detail a little bit in this class, but more so in the exercise physiology class that a lot of you are either taking now or will take in the future. So we'll take a look at the different factors that affect the ability of a muscle to generate tension or strength of the muscle contraction. They include anatomical factors, some of which we've discussed or at least alluded to already, and then they also include some physiological factors, again, the way that muscles work. And this may include the way muscle tissue works or the way the nerves interact with the muscle, and we'll look at what that means. This is going to include how the muscle recruits, or how we recruit different motor units, the number of motor units, but also the type of electrical signal, or again, the type of neurological input we give to these motor units, which is going to be called rate coding and then synchronization. We'll also take a look at some factors related to the muscle tissue itself, such as the length of the muscle and its ability, therefore, to generate tension, and then also the speed of muscle contraction and how that affects the ability to generate force. And then finally, we'll look at some biomechanical factors. These we will look at in a greater depth in this class over the next couple of weeks. But again, the angle of pull of a muscle, the distance that the muscle attaches from the axis of rotation, these are some of the biomechanical factors that affect strength. So first off, when we look at muscle strength, there are some anatomical factors. What makes a muscle able to generate more force? Well, there's a number of factors. Some of them are very common sense, and some we've discussed already. The first is the muscle length and the number of fibers that are included in the length of the muscle. Fibers are typically arranged in series, so muscles that have, again, kind of are narrow but longer are not going to be as powerful, but those long muscles tend to be able to shorten a much greater distance and therefore produce force very quickly. So they produce fast motions, not necessarily powerful motions. So longer muscles tend to sacrifice strength for speed, or again, the amount or range that they can move a bone through a range of motion. We talked about that with muscle fiber arrangement, again, with longitudinal or fusiform muscles being able to, or parallel muscle fiber arrangements being able to generate speed, but not necessarily have as much strength. And then the muscle width, the wider a muscle is, generally it's going to be able to produce more force. So again, even if the fibers are arranged in parallel, wider muscles have more fibers and therefore can generate more force. So generally, again, longer muscles are going to provide more mobility, more speed of motion. Shorter muscles are going to provide more strength and more stability. Also, muscle size. Obviously, larger muscles can produce more strength because a muscle with a larger cross-sectional area is going to have more sarcomeres, more of these contractile units. Now again, a muscle with a larger cross-sectional area does not necessarily mean there's more muscle fibers, but those muscle fibers themselves are bigger. So again, there is a good bit of evidence that we have relatively the same number of muscle fibers throughout life. We do lose some as we get older. When we exercise, we don't increase the amount of muscle fibers we have. We increase the number of sarcomeres and therefore the contractile proteins within each muscle fiber. And that's how a muscle hypertrophies. That's how it gets bigger. So again, if I start lifting weights, one way that I get stronger is I hypertrophy, which means I have more of these tension-generating proteins and therefore can generate more force. And again, I use this term already, but you're probably all familiar with it. Hypertrophy is when a muscle increases in size or increases in cross-sectional area. Generally, that indicates also an increased ability to generate force. The opposite of hypertrophy is atrophy. That's where a muscle gets smaller. And again, muscles will hypertrophy or atrophy depending upon the amount of work we have them do. If we use our muscles a lot and in new ways, stressing them, we will hypertrophy. And again, if we don't use them, they will atrophy. We also talked about fiber architecture. Again, this is the angle at which the fibers attach to the tendon or the connective tissue component of muscle. And we said, again, the examples are fusiform and parallel. The fibers are going to be long and in parallel, so they're built for speed. And then peniform muscles, the fibers attach at an angle into the tendon, and therefore we can pack more fibers in the same area, and they're going to be more powerful. But again, not going to be able to contract as quickly. Muscle strength also is dependent upon the muscle fiber type. Slow twitch and fast twitch fibers we've discussed already. So when we look at a given skeletal muscle, all skeletal muscles are going to have a combination of both slow and fast twitch. The exercise we prescribe for the person will determine which type of muscle fibers hypertrophy the fastest or more. And again, muscle fiber type is going to affect the total strength or force that a muscle can generate. Both slow and fast twitch fibers generate similar amounts of force. It's just the rate at which they develop that force. Fast twitch obviously being faster, and then also how quickly they fatigue. So a muscle that has a lot of fast twitch may be able to generate force more quickly, but it's not going to be able to hold that force as long. Obviously, and slow twitch will be more fatigue resistant. Now, muscle strength is determined by, again, the number of fibers, the angle that these fibers insert into the tendons, that, again, the pull on the bones, and so on. But tension is developed, again, by the initiation of muscle contraction by input from alpha motor neurons. So, again, tension is created in a muscle when the alpha motor neuron is sending a signal from the central nervous system to a motor unit. And again, we said an alpha motor neuron goes to several fibers or maybe several thousand fibers. So we can generate tension by activating, a greater number of motor units at a given time. So we can activate a greater total percentage of the muscle fibers in a muscle by activating more motor units. The way motor units are activated, again, I'm going to draw, and I know you love when I draw, and I love when I draw myself. It's fun to do. Basically, the way nerves connect to muscles is they will send a signal. So if we were to measure the electrical activity in an alpha motor neuron, when your muscle is at rest, remember we still get some tension, so we'll see a signal every, couple of seconds, and that will cause a slight contraction of the muscle fibers that neuron, attaches to. If I begin exercising, if I try to contract this muscle, what we have is an increase in the rate of the firing of the alpha motor neuron that goes to the motor unit. So what we start to see is this. A quicker signal coming down that nerve. And what that will do is cause the muscle to contract each time that it receives this electrical signal or this signal from the nerve. We'll get a shortening of the proteins in the muscle fiber. If the signals are so close together that the muscle does not have time to lengthen again or relax, then the fiber will get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, therefore generating a greater amount of force. So the rate of firing of a motor unit is going to determine how much contractile force that motor unit exhibits. If we also send signals to multiple motor units, we'll generate a greater amount of contractile strength as well. One other thing that we can do is we can synchronize the firing of these motor units. So if we have several neurons going to these different motor units, if we synchronize these contractions so that they are shortening at the same time, we can cause an even greater increase in strength. So if my goal is to create the greatest amount of contraction, force of contraction in a muscle, I would want to activate all of my motor units in that muscle, and I would want to activate them at the same exact time so that they're all pulling and shortening at the same exact time. So I would increase the rate of firing of the motor units, I would increase the number of motor units that fire, and I would synchronize those signals. And again, luckily, I don't have to think about all this. My brain handles this for me. But again, this is something that will yield a greater increase in strength. Those of you that, again, work with patients and different your clients, when you start somebody on a strengthening program, they've been sedentary, and you start them on a weight lifting or, again, a resistance training program, we often see very significant gains in strength early on. The reason why that is because of these factors. What happens is with this new, using of their muscles, this new resistance training program, they rapidly get some neurological changes. They get better at activating a greater number of motor units. They get better at firing those motor units at a higher rate of speed, and they get better at synchronizing the motor units within one muscle, but also in muscles that work together. So that's why we see these initial very significant strength gains when a person begins a resistance training program. Later, the changes are because of hypertrophy and some of the other things that allow us to increase muscle force contraction. Well, those are just some of the factors that affect the amount of force that can be produced by a muscle. In the next presentation, I want to talk about how muscle length, the length of a muscle, can affect strength as well. This gets pretty heavy into some biomechanical concepts, the ideas of elasticity, and the contributions of the connective tissue to muscle force production. But I think it's really interesting and important for understanding how muscle functions as a whole.